a while, in 1 minute. Okay. Mas. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today is a special occasion of Wednesday Forum because we are collaborate with Universitas Sanata Dharma, and we are happy to welcoming Romo Albertus Bagus Laksana, Rector Universitas Sanata Dharma. Please applause, give applause, everyone. And Honorable Director of CRCS UGM, Bapak Samsul Ma'arif. Give applause. And thanks everyone for joining me in this special occasion of a Wednesday Forum. Since we know today, one of the ironies in contemporary discipline of religious studies that all practitioners have already recognized the phenomenological universality and the necessity of political, sociological, cultural, and historical approach to all religious traditions, but with one notably exceptions. This is strange aversions, since in addressing other academic scholars, we need to, since addressing academic scholars to speaking openly about the universal spirituality, the humanities dimensions that likewise are shared by people from all religious traditions. So today we will revisiting the works of Ibn Arabi on his tahqiq or realization, spiritual and combined spiritual and intellectual understanding that probably will become a potential approach to this obstacle. By listening thoroughly to the presentation of our distinguished speaker. So without any further ado, everyone, please join me in welcoming an Islamic humanities and philosophy expert from Department of Theology, Boston College, Professor James Morris.
I'm going to start with several tangential things. First of all, thank you for your introduction because you beautifully summarized what I have to talk about, or at least the dilemma that faces people who want to do religious studies more widely than within a single religious tradition. And so we'll say more about that. That's the topic of the lecture. But there are a few other things I want to say first of all. Thank you to those who invited me, in particular my former PhD student, Bagus Laksana, or Romo Bagus, I guess you could say, Pak Bagus, whatever. He's rector now, so he needs a higher title. But we've learned so much from Bagus over the years, and myself and other students and professors who followed him during his studies at Boston College. So, and the second group I wanted to say particular greetings and thanks to is I was fortunate enough to, I believe 9 years ago, teach a summer course for a month in ICRS. And actually had a few PhD students as well. And I learned a lot because I was planning to bring Boston College students to study here in Indonesia for at least a month, as I'd done for some years in Turkey. And unfortunately, it's hard to, when there are no courses in Indonesia, it was hard to motivate students to come here, even though I think it would have changed their lives. So I really am thankful to those people who welcomed me so warmly 9 years ago, and then apologizing in the way for not getting back sooner. But I'm certainly very happy to finally be back here. And secondly, because I know a little bit of what goes on at the ICRS and the CRCS, the doctoral and MA programs here, I was set this talk up to be a bit about people who are involved in the profession of religious studies, which is a very young academic discipline, and it's young everywhere, not just in Indonesia. So I'd like to start out by just asking if you are a MA or PhD student, and not a faculty member, but a student at those levels, a graduate student, could you just raise your hand so I'll know kind of that's the group I was, wow, I thought that would be the largest part of the audience. Welcome over here to the graduate students. And so it would help then to know what background the rest of you bring to the audience today. So are you students elsewhere? I wasn't just asking about ICRS, but elsewhere. In any case, welcome. I hope I'll have something to say. If my title, which is Ibn Arabi and Aspects of Spiritual Universality, Navigating Between Religion and Religious Studies, in some ways we could make it much shorter apart from the side that relates to the field of study of religions. What I'm really taking up is the field of how do we talk about, understand, and study the phenomenology of religious experience, which on the one hand, as a dimension of human life, is the most universal dimension of religion. As the person who introduced me was kind enough to say, the sociological, political, economic, all the kind of public dimensions of religious life are not controversial in the sense that studying them involves universal categories and concepts, but people don't have to agree, and they're not so much true and false. They're just that way. But when you get to religious studies, in the way that it overlaps with theology, theologians are used to, and this goes on for millennia now, are used to asking questions, is this true or is it false? And in religious studies, we're usually asking the question, is it real? The word in Arabic, haq, is used for both, but what I'll be talking about today is techniques or methods or approaches that were developed in the Islamic tradition for tahqiq, which is impossible to translate in any language that I know of other than the original Arabic, because it means paying attention to the phenomenology. What are the phenomena, the realities that are involved in each person's religious experience? And at the same time, it involves the idea of a critique in the sense of at least looking at what are common features, what are distinctive individual features. And so it kind of combines a intellectual critical approach with a phenomenological approach. And I like talking about that because I think the whole field of religious studies, if it's not to end up being a kind of branch of politics and sociology and anthropology, really needs to continue to take seriously the problem of individual spiritual experience. So in that regard too, that's why I put navigating between religion and religious studies, because, and I have to ask, is the person who designed this poster here? I just wanted to say thanks because I thought it was an amazing poster, and I still didn't see if you're out there, you haven't volunteered yourself, but I really appreciate that. So thank you, in any case. One of the ironies about religious studies as a new field, and it's there, by the way, since a lot of you aren't apparently graduate students in that field, in Europe, there's been for more than a century a field that was called the comparative study of religion or comparative religions, or sometimes they said religious studies. But it was a graduate level discipline that developed in Germany, Scandinavian countries, France, and was definitely something that people would study from a very specialized point of view. In fact, I guess the most common name was the history of religions. That fed into the development of the field of religious studies, or study of religion, but it really developed primarily, I've kind of in my lifetime lived through all the stages of it. I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. Before undergraduates were doing religious studies, but we had people who were teaching there like Mircea Eliade, Jonathan Z. Smith, on the anthropological side, Victor Turner, I was going to say Ramanujan. So basically a lot of the people that people in religious studies now study as their sort of methodological textbooks, these were the people who were teaching there, but in different disciplines. But what really brought religious studies to the fore in American academia, and I emphasize American because I don't think in Europe, by the way, it's not because European countries are less religious. They may be less formally religious, but that's not the cause. But in America, you have so many different denominations and forms of religion that there's really a tremendous need on the part of both students to make sense of all this diversity of religious life. And by the way, it's no longer just different Christian denominations, but every imaginable Muslim and Buddhist forms of religion now have large communities in the US. So the need for religious studies grew out of something that undergraduates always have as a need in that country, is very simple questions. Where did we come from? Who are, what's a human being? Where did we come from? It's essential. Where are we going after this life? Of course, it's very easy if you're a Marxist to say, well, you came from nothing and you're going nowhere. But, and Marxism was a very influential ideology when I was growing up. But every religion I can think of takes very seriously those two questions of where do we come from as human beings, where are we going, and what do we have to do in this life to sort of move towards where we're going. And of course, most religious theology departments, religious educational institutions, have their own particular denominational or confessional answers to those basic fundamental questions. But in America, and I think increasingly in the rest of the world, those answers don't get across very well to students until they get to the college, university level, because before that, it's sufficient to belong to a group, to attend, to practice the rituals of a particular group. But certainly in my experience in the US, is people's level of understanding of traditional forms of theology and religious understanding is fairly limited, and college is where they first encounter it. So the religious studies departments on the undergraduate level are really devoted to those you could call traditional philosophical or theological questions, but at a level that necessarily involves comparison of different traditions. And what happened as this field developed, especially at the graduate level, is people, a good many practitioners, professors at the level of teaching these religious studies courses, came up against this dilemma of how do we talk about religious experience without being taken to be theology professors of this or that group. And institutionally, the answer that many people came up with was, we'll just avoid talking about religious experience, even though that's the raison d'etre and the fundamental reason that people follow this or that religious tradition. It's much easier to talk about the social scientific aspects of religion. And nobody made a decision. I don't think anybody said, don't talk about religious experience. So you kind of have a dividing line between graduate studies, where people are expected to talk about universality, but in terms of social, political, historical terms, and undergraduates who are very interested in precisely the scriptures, the classics, the interpretations, all of the classical topics that theologians and mystics and interpreters would use in every major religious tradition. So what I wanted to talk about today was certainly not an answer to that dilemma, but just to mention one on the Islamic side. There's one school and one particular individual who did a wonderful job in allowing Muslims from endlessly different schools of thought, madhahib, endlessly different cultures, from West Africa all the way across to Indonesia, to enable Muslims in all those places to talk to each other and communicate what they were experiencing. Now, that communication was not possible because they were all from the same religion, because most people, if you're participating and know a little bit historically about the major religious traditions, know that actually the differences between schools and different disciplines and ways of going about it are actually much more marked intra-religiously than they are inter-religiously. So, but the figure of a person called Ibn Arabi is the person I just wanted to talk a little bit about today, because there are a lot of misunderstandings of what he does and what he did. But for about 500 years anyway, after his time, he died in the 1200s of the Common Era, that he became kind of the theologian or thinker of reference whenever Muslims wanted to understand both their varieties and dimensions of their own faith and also the same realities in the experience of human beings who belong to other religious traditions. Recently, and that's why I didn't mention the last 2 centuries, because of the reaction to colonialism, or you could call it the resistant movements, decolonial movements, the political dimensions of Islam that we nowadays often associate with Abdul Wahhab and what's called the Wahhabi or the Salafi movements. From the point of view of those recent theologies or schools of religion in Islam, Ibn Arabi is often portrayed, if not with takfir, treating him and people who followed his approach as completely alien and hostile to religion, that at least to see them as marginalized. They might call them Sufis or something like that, but always with a pejorative sense of the term. But actually, until very recently, when Muslims were in charge of their own political future and off of many other faiths, if you think of the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and to some extent the Safavids between those, the governments, if you will, supported Ibn Arabi and the madrasas and so forth. So he wasn't a marginal figure, but his ideas, especially those which grew up around the interpretation of his book, The Bezels of Wisdom, Fusus al-Hikam, were in a way the official government theologies, because Ibn Arabi really allowed for a deep admission of the spiritual realities that are shared by people from different forms of Islam and different other religions. There's a story I often mention that kind of illustrates this. It may be a little tangential here, but I'm going to mention it anyway. I remember in 1989, a group in New York sponsored a conference, really global conference with scholars of mysticism or spirituality from all around the world, really the leading figures, on a Spanish mystic, philosopher, thinker, really almost a mirror image of Ibn Arabi in terms of the breadth of what he did, a man called Nachmanides, whose years of birth and death are almost identical with those of Ibn Arabi. So most of us there had no ideas, not much, about Jewish thought, but for some reason they'd invited scholars of Christian and Muslim, actually Hindu and other mystical traditions, if you will, or philosophical traditions. And this was a 3-day conference, but about an hour and a half or 2 hours into the conference, one of the speakers, who was a Catholic professor of Counter-Reformation at Yale, a very famous man named Louis Dupree, stood up and he said, "Boy, if Ibn Arabi didn't exist, we'd have to invent him." And this was 1989, and the comment was true because almost everybody was referring to Ibn Arabi to try and understand the relationship between these classics of Jewish thought and Christian, Muslim, and other traditions. And also because there were almost no real translations to speak of. Some works by Henri Corbin that had been in French and made into English, maybe one sort of book about some famous Sufis, but almost nothing in English and in French about the major scholarly languages at that time, about who Ibn Arabi was. And yet people were standing up and saying, you know, if we didn't have him, we'd have to invent him. And so it was a true statement, and a lot of people definitely could see the truth of what was being said. But it also, what I'm going to talk about today, really has to do with some of the things that you'll find in his writing as a kind of method of approach to the phenomenology of spiritual life that helped underlie at least this very prescient and kind of prophetic appreciation of what he had to offer. one thing I should say is I'm not talking about Ibn Arabi as a philosopher with his own school and his distinctive concepts and so forth. What I'm talking about is the way that he was used traditionally, which was within tariqas, within madrasas, by people who wanted to understand their own faith and how it related to the faith of others. And that kind of understanding is very revelatory, I think. I teach all sorts of aspects of Islam in my years of teaching. By the way, I should mention outside, I have 3 books that are in press, but not yet there. I'm going to bring those books. But anybody who's curious, I've got a book about Ibn Arabi's approaches to tahqiq, or realization, that's out there. A book about, more generally about Islam, the Quran, Hadith, and the Islamic humanities, the arts, wayang, just all the different Islamic humanities that are essential to communicating Islam in traditional Muslim cultures. And another book about an important, well, I brought several different books I had about different aspects of Shiite spirituality, not from the Imami tradition, but from other widely neglected but extremely important traditions of Shiite thought, which overlap to some sense with Sufism, but still have their own distinctive qualities. I was teaching all of those things, and also I've written a lot and have book-length monographs on Islamic philosophy as well, on Biruni, Ibn Sina, Farabi, and Ibn Khaldun. So I've been lucky enough to teach for 45, 50 years, and so pretty much I've gotten to the point where no matter what aspect of Islamic thought you might think of, I've been able to teach it. And I found that in the end, Ibn Arabi is the person, again, who helps us connect with the spiritual implications of each of these different schools of thought. And by the way, there's a couple of things that I also would like to, just because they annoy me a lot. People will often call people like Ibn Arabi, they'll call them mystics or urafa, like spiritual knowers or whatever. But almost any of the terms they use in Islam and outside Islam with regard to Ibn Arabi and parallel figures in other traditions would imply that there's something called mysticism that's somehow separate and a kind of elite activity. Outsiders might criticize it as being elite, or people might be proud of it being elite. But the one thing I think that anybody, no matter what religion you come from, can say is that spiritual life is not elite. It's actually human life, and humans are spiritual beings. They happen to be in bodies for a while, but that is not something that's elite, far from it. What's important is that the ability that we have potentially to grasp what's unique and individual about spiritual experience. So I just, as a scholar, I always usually when people talk about mysticism or elites, it's usually pretty dismissive, and I think it's just not realistic. People sort of confusing the methods of spiritual inquiry called tahqiq. They're confusing those with schools of philosophy or theology. So, but you might say, what I can't do in here, we now have translations, so you can look up translations of a lot of important works of Ibn Arabi and some good interpretive studies. But what I've been doing in particular since 2007, since right after I came to BC, which is now a lot of years, coming up on 2 decades, I'd say, is that I've been doing a seminar every year. Usually we held it over at Harvard, the facilities and the interested students in the graduate studies in religion. There were more of them over at Harvard, so we tend to do it there. But seminars with people from all over the Muslim world and from many different religious traditions. And what you quickly discover when you're trying to teach Ibn Arabi, not as something that people are going to believe in, but rather asking at each point, okay, we just read him say something about religious life. What's your own experience that underlies or matches up with what he's saying there? And you can ask that question of somebody who's religious or unreligious or anti-religious, because the topics and the themes that he takes up about, again, where we've come from, what we're supposed to do here, where we're headed, are ones that everybody has some kind of implicit answer to, even if they think of themselves as not religious at all. And in fact, often the most authentic and realistic answers to those metaphysical, spiritual questions are brought out by students who themselves are not particularly raised in this or that form or religious tradition. So what I wanted to do in the rest of this talk, and when should we stop? Right at, say, 2 o'clock? I mean, we got a late start, so is that about then? I think that gives me time to cover the points I want to make here. So we'll leave a lot of time for questions, I think. So I'm just going to go through some of these topics that, although Ibn Arabi in the Islamic tradition probably gives the most detailed treatment of them, they have their parallels in other traditions. In fact, perhaps some of you will be helpful in the question and answer period to say, who are the equivalents of what Ibn Arabi is providing in other traditions? Well, I'll start off with one, and they're all important, so I'm not listing them in order of either greater or decreasing importance. But one of the first things that you have to delve deeply into people's experience in order to understand them is the problem of discernment. In Arabic, it's tamyiz. That is, given that someone has particular spiritual experiences, not thoughts about it, but actual experiences, and everyone does, how do we do two things at once? One is figuring out what is the import of those experiences, and then there are some chapters in Ibn Arabi's Futuhat that some I've translated, some I not, but I think probably my next and last book will be on this question of spiritual discernment, because it has to do with method and approaches to religious experience. It has to do with the intersection between theological parameters and actual experience, and it has to do with putting it into practice, because if you have an issue that requires discernment, it really means that, by the way, sometimes I use sort of semi-technical words. Is there anybody here who's having trouble following me at the speed that I'm talking? Because I'm happy to slow down. I don't know what that laughing means, of course, or because Bagus warned me when I'm talking to undergraduates later this afternoon that I have to slow down, and so he'll raise his hand or hit me with a stick or something if I go too fast. But am I going too fast? That's basically what I'm asking. It's okay? Okay, because we expect grad students to be multilingual and very quick. Okay, so I'll worry about this afternoon with undergrads. Okay, so, but just to give you an example of what happens here with this idea of tamyiz, and of course, people everywhere all the time have to practice some kind of spiritual discernment. It may come from the direction of they've been told that their religion has all the answers, but when you connect those theological, doctrinal, conceptual answers to actual experience, there's always issues that come up with how do I interpret that experience. I think I'm talking next week over on Sulawesi about the occasion of a maulid or of a famous wali in central South Sulawesi. And questions about the imamate in Islam are excellent questions about discernment, because officially people tend to belong to this or that Shiite branch, be it Ismaili or Bohra or Khoja or Ahl-Haq, all different groups I've written on. But when you sort of ask, well, what does it mean when you say there are this many imams, or they're accessible outwardly, or they're accessible historically, or their realities accessible in the heart? Anybody who talks about the imamate has to raise a whole host, and whether you're within a Shiite question or without, you have a whole host of practical questions that you have to decide for yourself. And these aren't things that theologians just have to decide. They're questions that ordinarily mothers and fathers and their children have to decide within whatever religious tradition they're raising their children. The answers, by the way, are not given by those traditions. The problems are set up by those traditions. So if I can take something that's kind of foreign to most people here probably, but say in the US would be a significant group of people who are Jewish. You might belong to a Reformed Jewish background, an Orthodox background, a group that kind of dresses certain ways and rejects the world, and other groups that are kind of liberal and semi-Marxist oh, religion isn't, it's just ethical. You have all of those different possibilities for what Judaism might mean. How are you going to raise your kids? And it's a question the same for anybody who's Muslim. If you have, I think, the best spiritual education anyone can have, I'm both selfish and egoistic in mentioning this, is just to have lots of kids. Because if you have lots of kids, you discover that the spiritual individuality of each child is absolutely astonishing. I mean, you have kids that come into this world with very strict, fixed ideas, tell you where they came from, what they did before this life. You have other kids who are kind of spiritual in a way that looks awesome because it's, and you have other people who are very worldly and are only concerned with how they're going to make a living and then to make money. All of those things are not imposed on children by their parents. They're realities of the individuality of human beings that the parents have to help in some ways either support or build upon, or, and I say parents here, but of course it can be religious teachers, it can be anyone who claims some kind of authority or an ability to do what in Arabic is called tarbiyah, the kind of spiritual education and upraising of children. So I mentioned that, I sort of put this first because I knew Bagas would be here, but in terms of this theme of discernment, that's universal in the largest sense, but I know in the Christian tradition, it's very easy if you've taught at a place like BC for a number of years to think of a person called Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuit order. Some people are nodding back there, so I guess you've got some Son of the Dharma students who maybe came here. But, you know, it's interesting because I've had Jesuit students who read Ibn Arabi say, this sounds a lot like things that Ignatius was writing about, because they're questions of method in spiritual teaching. Another person that I taught didn't have to do, when I started out in Princeton and Oberlin, was a woman named St. Teresa of Avila, and who was later made a doctor of the Catholic Church. But I like teaching St. Teresa because she's a woman, first of all, and most of her writings are writings that she did for women who are devoted to the spiritual life. But so she was writing for women in a variety of places in Spain. But her writings are very practical spiritually, and students, again, from every background, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, they love reading St. Teresa because she's really down to earth about what it is, what are the temptations that we face in life, how do we find guidance, where do we turn for help. And one of the things you discover, of course, is that whether it be Ignatius or St. Teresa, or another one who in poetry does much the same thing, called St. John of the Cross, is that these are all, in a way, they're heirs to the Muslim Arab Sufi tradition, both of learned Islamic religion and of popular devotional life and so forth. That, again, now later on in the context of the Reformation or Reconquista, they're like people would never think to mention them together, but if you look at them historically, they're just these profound roots in the deeper dimensions of the Abrahamic tradition that are shared by these figures who are, in their own way, concerned about discernment. So moving on to another one that's very, very central in terms of just making sense of spiritual life is the question of ethical intuitions. Now, we use the term ethics, and I've got some professors of ethics here. Here's a gentleman from Baylor. You do teach about ethics, right? Kind of, because, we use the word as though we know what it means, but actually ethics covers such a broad area of human experience that one sense is kind of the ways that teachings of authority, be they political, social, or whatever about religion, are put into practice. So you think, here's the rule book, the application of that is ethics. How do I do that? So that's a different kind of thing. What I'm concerned about, though, is a much broader and idiosyncratic field, which is the ethical intuitions that people bring to life in the world around them. And I'll give some examples because they're, I think, very universal and very common in children. Usually, if you want to get away from formal religious constructions about spiritual reality, and look at how it actually arises in people's lives and souls, is you can usually start with children, because children have to be indoctrinated into any formal religion, but they have their whole religious life that they bring into the world and that they develop. And ethical intuition has struck me because I grew up in a village, on a farm, like most people did 50 years ago in Indonesia. But one thing that I couldn't get over was what I was asked to do to animals. Is anybody here knows all the horrible things you have to do to animals if you're raising them on a farm? I'm not going to mention the words, but somebody's, where those pigs and cows and sheep and all the meat comes from. By and large, in the modern world, we rarely have any. The best you have is maybe at Eid al-Adha, you'll sacrifice a sheep or a goat or a camel or whatever. But apart from that, we don't have to do the animals. And even if we buy them in a market for sacrifices at Eid, that's a very limited context. So one of those, just as an example of profound spiritual intuitions that we have that we don't get from outside organizations, be they religious or non-religious, is our inner affinity with animals. And that has to do with our ethical treatment of them, but it also has to do with a kind of identification that people often have. Generally, it doesn't matter what part of the world you come from, this is front and foremost in indigenous religious traditions. I happen to know when I was a kid, I identified with being Cherokee. It had to be a kind of mythology of the family. But on both sides, we had parts of the members that came from Cherokee and Choctaw territory, including Oklahoma. And I had a great-grandfather who married a Texas Ranger who married a Choctaw woman. Now, that is kind of the incongruity. He was a preacher and a Texas Ranger. So it's basically, my vision is that he pulled out his pistol and said, "You're going to be Baptist," and then they raised their children Baptist, But and who knows? By then, the Native American tribes often were very much assimilated to whatever the local brands of religion were. But in Indonesia, I think I was looking up. My wife asked me something. How many languages do they speak here? And Wikipedia anyway said there's more than 700 languages on the different islands in Indonesia. Well, anybody who knows one of those indigenous languages probably isn't just Muslim or Christian, but they probably are heirs to a wide range of indigenous spirituality, be it just have to do with certain sacrifices or certain things you do faced with certain circumstances in life, But there isn't any place in the world where you don't have indigenous groups where usually this role of animals as symbolic connections to divine names or qualities, to take the terms of official Islam, that these aren't important. And I don't think I have to provide illustrations because I suspect that wherever you live, the word indigenous, it's First Nations in Canada, it'll be something else. Pretty much everybody in Mexico is, if you looked at their blood, they're mostly Native Americans. They're not Spanish or Hispanic. There are some Latin American countries that are from largely European in background. But this is a topic where, again, Ibn Arabi has plenty of room for the phenomenology of these particular things, these particular experiences. And notice that the approach of tahqiq is not first, is this good or bad? Is it right or wrong? It's, what does this mean? The fundamental question is what is the meaning of the experiences that we have in life in different ways? I mean, here I grew up on a farm. I had to do terrible things to animals. Okay, I don't eat pork. That was an improvement. But that happened long before I became Muslim. But I still go to McDonald's. Don't tell anybody. But sometimes my students are horrified when they find out that I eat hamburgers. It isn't just, is it a ritual question? Not for the kids who have their strong feelings about those particular ethical intuitions. Another huge area of spirituality that we all engage in one way or another is the phenomena surrounding wilaya. Wilaya is just another term for the realities surrounding the divine term. In Islamic framework, the divine term, al-wali, the one who is close, not the wali, the ruler. No, al-wali is the one who is close. God is protector, guide, support, sustenance. And you might say that walaya is embodied in all the different expressions of the Islamic humanities and the humanities of other traditions. It's something that's perfectly natural, and in most cases, we're not even aware of that as something particularly religious. We simply live within a cocoon of walaya that's particular to our culture, our religious tradition. In more specific senses, it can be used to apply to what we call saints, awliyaullah, the holy people, and so forth. But when you, instead of using these inherited English or Western terms, if you just ask, how are we aware of God's proximity, guidance, support, sustenance? The answers are as unique and different as there are human beings. It's really, if there's, the thing about each of these points I'm going to mention is if you just stop and have enough intimacy of contact with other people and ask them, how would you answer this question? You begin to discover that God is working through every single human being. I start to tear up. I'm sorry when I think of this, because having been fortunate enough to teach for so many decades, it's something that you take for granted, except each time you begin to realize that Ibn Arabi and people like him and other traditions are really trying to get us simply to wake up to this closeness. Walaya, by the way, al-wali, is one of those divine names that you could say is adjacent to all the other. In this school of thought, people often use the divine names, you might say, the Platonic forms, the bases of reality, to talk about everything that we experience in the world and is created in the world. And wali, God's closeness, really what divine name, what attribute, what quality of our existence is not related to that divine closeness? And by the way, and this is something, again, I think until you see it in practice, it's a little strange, but you might think that this Quranic theological language of divine names and divine supports and everything, that you couldn't make any sense of this unless you were born and raised a Muslim and spent a lot of time studying Kalam or schools of theology and so forth. But in fact, no, anybody who's secular, atheist, or whatever, as soon as you start practicing the spiritual questioning of our experience, turns out that, yeah, we all have an experience of walaya. We might not call it that, but it's something that's a basic starting point for our existence, making sense of our own existence and of our interactions with other people. Another thing is that is very central in Ibn Arabi is the notion that each of us has an individual living encounter with divine inspiration and guidance. This is a little different than just, walaya has more the sense of support, direction, but when we run into problems in life, where do we turn? Well, we turn to prayer, no matter what the religion in question probably is. But the term that Ibn Arabi often uses is the term shar, and it's associated in modern Arabic usage with the term sharia. But when you go back and notice the way in which it's actually used in the Quran and Hadith and so forth, it really goes, he usually works from the roots, the etymological roots of the Arabic thing. So shar is the opening of a pathway or a prescription that leads to the water of life. The word sharia for road is originally one for road, for path leading to water. And so Ibn Arabi often talks, and similar figures in other traditions do as well, about each of us has that possibility of finding that living encounter with divine inspiration if we simply devote ourselves to it. I won't go any deeper here, because if I did, I'd make Sufis sound like Quakers. I don't know whether the Quaker tradition is even known to anybody, but some of our colleagues from America. But there's a lot of not only similarities between Sufi practice and the Quaker faith, but in fact, you walk into a session of one or the other, you might not have to be told which you're actually in. Okay, the next thing is that I just want to mention, because these are just forms of experience where tahqiq is necessary, is the dynamics of our spiritual growth and each individual's experience, interplay of suffering, struggle, and grace. I think this is a good example. Like, none of experience never happens to us, no matter whether it's dreams, whether it's revelations, whether it's things we're taught and have to figure out are they true or not. On all of those areas, what gives sense to what we experience is the story of which it is a part. Each of us has a story that we're usually not particularly conscious about unless we run into other people's very different stories about the meaning of their existence and so forth. But what all of those stories, doesn't matter, tradition, have in common is suffering, struggle that comes with suffering. You know, Ibn Arabi often says, if it weren't for suffering, and every spiritual writer in the tradition talks about it, we wouldn't learn anything. We only our motivation primarily in life and spiritual life comes from suffering and the attempt to overcome it. This is like ABCs of spiritual life and spiritual growth, but it's a key dimension of tahqiq because, and it's also very practical. Without that, people go through endless attempts to overcome and get around suffering in their lives. Everything from, at the one extreme, doing away with yourself with drugs and escapes and so forth, and another extreme, becoming very dogmatic and saying, well, I'm not going to ask this question anymore, and kind of everything in between. But grace, and whatever the terms, there's plenty of terms for it in Islam, grace just means those times when we discover the answers. And you don't usually discover the answers, you're usually given the answers in some domain through our interactions with others in life. So I'm afraid I don't want anyone to take any of the terms, Muslim or otherwise, that I use for these different dimensions of tahqiq. Don't take them as, what's important is not the term, but the actual reality as we experience it. And just to by the way, if you think that this, is there anybody here who doesn't have fairly recurrent images and memories of suffering in their life? Come on. Khosh behalat, as they say. You're lucky if you don't. I'm always looking forward to meeting with such people, because as they say about the awliya in the Quran, la khawf alayhim wa hum la yahzanun, that they're neither fearful nor are they disappointed in God. That this is the people who are really close to God who can actually guide us almost immediately from their experience, are the people who don't suffer in the same way that most of us suffer, and leading to confusion and dilemmas and so forth. So again, I could say a lot more about this, but time is limited. Another thing that's even larger is the proximity in everybody's experience, and again, it doesn't matter if they're religious or not, in everybody's unique and formative experience of our proximity with, we could call, the other dimensions of life. You could call them the timeless dimensions of life, or you could call them, and usually, again, children will reveal them, the dimensions before, of worlds and experience before this lifetime, of things that are going on with our inner relations, with things that are beyond ourselves. Often we're mystified by those, and after our earthly existence, because, again, maybe this is most obvious in indigenous traditions, but people are very shaped by, and again, often unconsciously, by their connections with things and people that existed before, during, and after our earthly existence. And by the way, this is very helpful, actually, in developing some of the key spiritual virtues, because as soon as someone has an awareness of how incredibly diverse al-akhirah, the other world, is, because usually once you have some minimal contact, you discover, and you talk to other people about their contacts with all those dimensions of spiritual worlds beyond our world, this dunya. The word dunya is used in Arabic. First of all, it's usually adjectival. It's hayat dunya in the Quran. It means the life that's closest or lowest life. And then al-akhirah is not just what comes next or what's above, but it's everything else. And actually, the more experience you have spiritually of those other dimensions of reality, the more humility and gratitude are the two things that just spontaneously arise in your description. Because anything that you're given from the awareness of those forms of guidance is something you're given that you didn't earn, and it's also something that, and therefore the gratitude that comes from that is tremendous. And you also, you're aware that whatever you think you know and whether you experience religiously is a constant gift. I'm curious, how many people here in life have had moments when the spiritual sustenance and awareness that you ordinarily have in life, that you took for granted, when that's suddenly taken away? It can be a shocking outer event, or it can just be a particular test that you're sent, where I had an experience the last 4 or 5 days, because basically I feel like jet lag is a kind of lobotomy, spiritual lobotomy. I know there are people who apparently, like Buck Bogus, who can fly from one country to another and never lose sense of it. But I feel like my humanity, and I could actually over the last few days watch that my actual inner life began to come back to life, like I died and come back, because jet lag just kind of shuts it all down. But of course, there have been times in life where I would get spiritually cocky and self-confident and think, oh, wow, things are going great. And there's no better recipe for getting hit with a stick by God than thinking that you're doing great. And anybody who practices any kind of spiritual tradition, whatever, ego and the ways that the ego is cured or are transformed or matured, those are things that are essential to our spiritual life. Another thing, just a couple more, we certainly won't take more than an hour. I just want to see which ones I can use. I'll just say, the other thing that's very central to tahqiq and to its importance is to realize that when we are actually experiencing directly and not in a mediated form, experiencing spiritual life, there's an actual assumption of equality and spontaneous spiritual empathy with other people. In other words, every religion tells us act out of love. God is love in one way or another. The words are different, but Ibn Arabi spends all of his time trying to wake us to that universality of rahmah, or of walaya, of all these different words you have in Arabic for the divine. But one of the easiest ways of just recognizing both where that's mirrored back to us and at the same time where we have that kind of effect on other people is that you don't see people ranked. People all the time talk about spiritual ranks. Doesn't matter, Sufism, religion, whatever. Spiritual ranks as though somehow there's a higher and a lower, and we want to strive to be in the higher ranks or improve in that sense. But the problem, as Ibn Arabi points out, and as teachers point out in equivalent areas in other disciplines, other traditions, is that spiritual life is something that's spontaneous, and we spoil it if we try and turn it into terms of ranks and I've got more than you, I've been more graced than you, and so forth. Or the other ways we spoil it is with beliefs, trying to cram our experience into this or that, some system of beliefs. Ibn Arabi, again, has a very interesting term for this process of discovering reality. He calls it wujud. And people who don't know any better, they say, oh, this is the school, because it later came to mean being in the philosophical concept. But wujud in his usage comes from two senses, which are in a way inseparable. One is finding what we've been looking for in life, finding the spirit in what looked like a desolate desert of existence. And the other is the ecstasy, the wajd, that flows from this interplay with Arabic words. Doesn't matter, you don't need to know Arabic, but that inseparability of equality, empathy, and finding is not only something that's central in Ibn Arabi's thought, but more particularly where we discover the deeper spiritualities of our lives usually takes place through what, as an outsider, we can call the local humanities, be they Islamic or Christian or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I happen to be particularly awed by the existence and forms of the Wayang tradition here in Indonesia, please export it as much as you can, not as a tourist device to bring people to Bali or whatever, but simply as a way of living. People learn, all these things that we learn are dramas. And dramatization is something that has come and gone at different times. How many people here have happened to have read at least the Inferno part of Dante's Divine Comedy? I say the Inferno part because that's what sells. The bestseller is hell. That's what people understand the most. But you really, if you want to use a spiritual text, you need to visit purgatory and know about paradise, at least, even if the poets all want to translate the Inferno. So dramas like that exist in other traditions. They're mystic plays. In fact, most of the, this is also one of the areas where Dante and others were taking over things from the pagan traditions of the Greeks and the Romans and bringing them into a Christian context. In other words, if we look at what becomes Islamic culture anywhere in the world, Wayang is just a later and local example here in Indonesia, but wherever you might look, whether that be in the music domain, in the domain of social forms, in rituals, in all of those areas, the discovery of these different forms of spiritual life and the ways you can put them into practice usually doesn't happen in the normal rituals, but it happens in the interplay between those rituals, which are basically reminders. In Islam, what you call dhikr are reminders. And in fact, that they happen, as I said, I've just mentioned the case of children. Another case might be anything involving love. Love is kind of the spiritual spotlight that reveals to us the essential facets and conditions of our spiritual existence. And I don't mean here just romantic love. It's probably love in all of its aspects. Something I'm translating right now is a section in Ibn Arabi's huge chapter on love, one of the most important of his works in the Futuhat, where he talks about basically the divine and human love relationship. Yuhibbuhum yuhibbunhu. God loves them and they love him. Them, each of us, if you will, each of the would-be awliya. And sort of in which he brings out how love underlies all of our truly selflessly ethical actions and connections, whether with God in the spiritual world or with other beings in our lives. Something we're told in sermons and in scriptural texts and all in every tradition, but that we have to only discover it through tradition and often through the absence of that love which should exist there. I think we've done now an hour. I'm almost on the dot, I hope. But I could go on. Obviously, I have quite a few pages here. But each of these things is something that you can experience, judge, evaluate, put to use, and we do it all the time, but this is what Ibn Arabi is talking about when he talks about tahqiq, and as a kind of gift he left not only for the Islamic tradition, but the one going to be take over from people, whether they think that they're secular and non-religious or religious from other backgrounds. But the first thing I would ask is, what are the texts from another tradition you know? The teachers that do what I was talking about with Ibn Arabi. What are the people in Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity and so forth? I mentioned a few of them, but in traditions that may be less familiar to some of us, but more familiar to others, what are those texts that have the same function in illuminating the spiritual dimensions of our life and enabling us to share them, to deepen our experience, and at the same time to share them and be teachers for everyone around us? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor James. Before I start the discussions, I'll give credit to the poster designer. It's Mas Rizal Abdi. This is our college from CRCS batch 2015, and he also write an introduction script that I've read earlier. Okay, and yeah, we opened the.
Can I just say
okay.
That the thing is, I had to put this together only recently. When I kind of knew the audience I thought I would have. It's bigger than what I thought I would have, but the grad students and all. And his theme there, the paddleboard, with the dervish,
Yeah.
that's so much truer to what I was going to say than anything I could have thought of myself. So thank you.
Thank you, Mas Abdi.
This is,
Let's more appreciate for every artwork in our life. Okay. And yeah, okay, let's discuss. Is something any question or comment? Oh, who come first? Okay, you may introduce your name and your institution. Okay, that's.
Okay, thank you so much for your insightful exposition of Ibn Arabi. By and large, people who try to conduct interreligious dialogue in a theological or mystical fashion utilize Ibn Arabi as foreground, because thus Ibn Arabi himself is designated as the promoter of the so-called the transcendence unity of religion. And I think also Ibn Arabi himself also advocates, when talking in Fususul Hikam, about Noah, the way how Noah asked his people to worship the one God in a tanzih manner. And I think Ibn Arabi in this context encapsulates the universality of all forms of worshipping God. It has all forms of how to express our religiosity. And I want to ask about actually how is the epistemological position of Ibn Arabi? How does
the what position?
Epistemological
Epistemological.
position, like a conceptual set Ibn Arabi brought about in his mystical journey and his mystical experience. I also wonder what if Ibn Arabi had not been a Muslim, that his experiences would his experiences have been the same to understand he called wujud. And usually in mystical discourses, Ibn Arabi also, scholars bring Ibn Arabi as the promoter of the commonalities of mystical experience or spiritual experiences. And how is the position of Ibn, what is the differences if there are commonalities in spiritual experience between, let's say, wujud and nothingness? It sounds that the two are really opposed each other. That's all. Thank you so much.
Very brilliant questions. What's your name, Mas?
Oh, yeah. I'm Angga from CRCS.
Oh, okay.
Again, first,
Yeah, you may answer.
actually, I'm at that point in life where I bought hearing aids, and my wife says I don't ever wear them, which is true. And I actually thought of bringing it along, but it's precisely in these little things like hearing your name that I might make a mistake. But fortunately, for our purposes here, I don't need them. So, but forgive me if I didn't catch the details of your name. What our friend here is alluding to is some of the schools of thought. It's basically whether you call it theological or philosophical thought, kind of depends, doesn't really matter, that grew up around the interpretation in the Eastern Islamic world. There's a kind of division in the heritage of Ibn Arabi and how people understood him. In the Mashriq, Persian was the educated language of the time. I mean, ulama could do and teach in Arabic. But understanding what Ibn Arabi was writing about took a lot of learning, a lot of deep knowledge of Arabic and their traditions. So in the eastern part of the Islamic world, people assimilated Ibn Arabi's teachings, particularly in the text Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom that you mentioned, as a kind of interpretive tradition around that particular text. And they even called it the Akbari school, sort of the Ibn Arabi school of thought and so forth. When I was educated in Iran and elsewhere with Koran, Izutsu, people like that, or Ashtiani, people who knew that tradition well, I kind of thought of it as a kind of philosophy. It was very natural to go from Plato, say, to that tradition, or Aristotle and the philosopher to that tradition. Didn't happen that way in the Western Islamic world because people could speak Arabic and read it. The Arabic was their language. And so it wasn't a learned elite who interpreted Ibn Arabi, but it was everybody had access to many works of his, not just to the Fusus and Hikam. And the result was that in much of the Maghrib, and by that I mean not just North Africa, but also present-day West Africa, what we call in the central Islamic lands is often called Sufism or Irfan or something like a spiritual Islam, that in West Africa and all the politics and society and everything are all in the form of Sufi tariqas. Take a country like Senegal. So I have students who come from those West African countries and all, and it's just wonderful when you get Muslims from different countries together talking, because then they realize that the Deen al-Haq, is quite different than the local customs that they took for granted wherever they grew up. It's not that one is good or bad or whatever. So this sense of Ibn Arabi is kind of promulgating a theology that's associated with this. It's very important historically. I'm just saying that what I've discovered in spending many years working with his writings, and especially the Futuhat, is I kind of had to start all over when I was teaching in Paris, and Michel Shudgevitz asked Bill Chittick and myself to do books on translations, a sort of introduction to the Futuhat. I said, wow, I didn't, this is all phenomenological. It's like you get a phrase in the Fusus, and then you get 10 pages of dense phenomenology in the Futuhat explaining what he meant in the Fusus. And so I had to start all over in terms of understanding Ibn Arabi. And what I translate and what I teach now is trying to focus in on those more universal phenomenological dimensions that I've talked about today that actually are, they overcome these questions, is this view right or is that view right? Because the interpretations become the interpretations of experience rather than the interpretations of people's ideas and concepts about experience. Do you understand the distinction I'm drawing there? And gosh, if you ask, like the training I got, the thing that made me most able to make that switch was growing up with, well, not growing up into college with really good Plato professors, because I fell in love with Plato as soon as I discovered him in college, because they were teachers who realized that the dialogues are not doctrinal. It's Aristotle who turned them into doctrine. He didn't like Plato much, so he sort of interpreted Plato in a way that sort of turns people off to him. But the dialogue, they're dramas, and they're like any drama, each of the characters in the dialogue represents a different natural human point of view. But it isn't like Plato is Socrates in the dialogue is his mouthpiece. Rather, and all you have to do is get a group of people together, take a dialogue of Plato that you all like, and just enact it, act it out. And about 15 minutes into it, you begin to see, wow, this is what Plato was talking about. He wasn't talking about this Greek thinker or this future philosophy of Plato. He was trying to get us to see that the ethical and spiritual issues that inform our lives are ones that we naturally have differences about, and those differences are what's being dramatized in each of the dialogues. I don't know to what extent Plato's known to people in their education here, but where I went to school, that a lot of the professors were refugees from Hitler, so they'd grown up in these European systems where the classics were very important, and that was really educational for me in understanding the specificities of Ibn Arabi's way of writing. And in Ibn Arabi, you could do the same thing if you take the ayahs from the Fusus or from, actually just pick something like this, Surat al-Yusuf, and have a number of people and have them take the different roles. Yusuf is helpful because it's like you've got the different parts, and so you can actually play it. And ask them, what went on there? What happened to Yaqub? Why is he saying that, I only complain to God. It's a nice spiritual principle. You can be taught, your teachers can teach you or whatever. But look at how often in life do we complain only to God and resist a temptation to complain to our spouse, to our parents, to our friends, whatever. What happens when you actually make that? It's so hard to do, first of all, because we're constantly complaining, to the world. Have you ever tried that? It's just what came into my mind as far as lessons, practical lessons in the Quran, But when the Quran says in several places in regard to qisas, to retaliation, where it says, okay, you can use qisas, you can try and order your society around qisas. But it always says, well, what is it? Oh, maghfira asan, is it maghfira, whatever the term is. Forgiveness is better. So say God is standing in front of you and says, forgiveness is better. Are you going to devote your life to figuring out how to get around that and circle your life around retaliation? Well, obviously not. It's just that if you're educated in a certain version of the scriptures, you'll find some way in which that forgiveness is better part will be set aside so you can continue to have this cycle of violence and response to violence and so forth that we're all familiar with in politics and personal life and so forth. So again, I would come back to not so much the doctrines and teachings of Ibn Arabi, but just he always takes you back to the Quran and Hadith. It's just that his understanding of those is rooted in a kind of experience that we don't usually, we only take seriously when we see people around us who are actually practicing that deeper understanding of the scripture. And by the way, the same thing is true in regard to Christianity. I grew up in a Christian society and culture, very religious family and everything like that. I'm just saying you have the same thing where when you finally start reading the Gospels, and particularly the three synoptic Gospels, it's like so different from all the other things you were taught in life that you begin to see why Jesus is the Waliullah, the last of the historical awliya and so forth. And but you don't get there usually by parental or school teachings or whatever. You usually have to have your own encounter with what's being conveyed in the three synoptic Gospels. And anybody here, there've got to be some of the people from Sanatha Dharma, Magasa School and so forth. Have you ever tried to actually, or be in a class where you introduce the Gospel of John to people who are more familiar with the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke? No? Because it ties in with the question you were raising there, which is, Jesus was a teacher, and officially later he becomes a theologian, but the theology that we think of as Christian theology is in Paul, and it's in the Gospel of John, and then people read it back into the three synoptic Gospels. But I can remember when I started reading about Sufism, and I thought, this is all Jesus' teachings. When I was just a kid, just the first thing in university, wasn't an expert in anything. But so I think that what you're asking about Ibn Arabi and the Fusus tradition and so forth is just part of this same issue that when we encounter someone who lives a spiritual teaching, lives it, they don't need that many words. They kind of take our breath away. So it's like if you're complaining to God all the time, or complaining to other people all the time, and you meet somebody who is living taslim or surrender to the way the world is. Of course, we have no idea how they got there. Never mind that. But we do meet people who are like that. I can remember I was telling our friend down there, being down in the backwoods of Texas when I was a kid, and meeting some people who, my wife was Catholic background, I was Protestant background, but we met these people. And they were, nowadays when people interview, well, where did you start learning about the awliya, the friends of God, those who are close to God? Well, there was just this couple out on their porch and out in the backwoods, and we stopped there and started talking to them. And that experience taught me more than years and years in college. And I think everybody, at some point in life, it can be a relative, it can be a person you see depicted fictionally, but without those awliya in life, we're kind of at a loss. And we have to devote a lot of our time to finding them and finding the people who are the real ulama. What does Ibn Arabi say? Al-ulama billah, not the ulama bil tasawarat and so forth, but the ones who actually knowing with, he says billah means with God, knowing through God, all of those things. And it's just a formula of words in Ibn Arabi. But in the Surah of Hud, in the Fasl of Hud, you know, there's that one where he says, there's not a path that people all have to follow. There's only one path where God takes you by the forelock. It's a phrase from the Quran. And wherever God takes you, that is the path. Because it's the only path you are following, and it's the only path you can follow, even though, if we're honest, that changes us as each step along the way. So that's my answer to your very deep question and a very common question that you asked. It's enough for now, I hope. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next to the second question. Okay, yeah, you can introduce your name.
Hello, my name is Ahmad, and I have one question to you. In your opinion, how does religion stand next to secularism? Could you explain it to me, reviewed from maybe your own view or your culture, country? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a question that I was thinking about talking about here, and I'll actually end up probably talking about it much more with Vargas's class later this afternoon, because in a sense, we all, even if we're religious in background, usually if we're strictly religious, we're kind of rebelling against the kind of secularism, whatever the religion might be. And certainly it's almost impossible to live in a non-secular environment today, if by that you mean an environment where we're aware of many alternative forms of life and lives that we can devote ourselves to. You know, the notion of a tradition as something that defined and prescribed one way of life, and anything other than that was secular, whether that be in the past or in the present. So I think what I've tried to say is my answer to that is in the different aspects of spiritual life that I brought up today, is that there are advantages and disadvantages to living in a more secular world today. The great advantage is truthfulness and austerity, because in a secular environment, we can't have that kind of hypocrisy that's unconscious, because everybody around us is saying all the right religious answers, and all we have to do is go along with that crowd, and we'll feel like we're following God's path and God's way and so forth. Perhaps I grew up in a society, in a world that was much more that way than anywhere you would find today. You know, there's still a village life with very few media connecting to us to the rest of the world, and everybody went to church, and everybody read the scriptures and might have argued about them. But in the world today, I had one of my sheikhs, I've had quite a few in life, and I guess, but the one who was formal, you know, once people asked a question like that, and he said, no, we're really lucky today, because before this secularized world, we kind of went with the flow of, you know, the world around us, and we assumed that that was going to help us grow and give the right answer spiritually. He said, in the world we live in today, all we do is have to swim upstream, because the stream is taking us straight to hell. You know, so all we have to do is kind of go the direction that's the opposite of that secularization, in the sense you mean it. I mean, this isn't something sociological question. It's a question of living in a world where our spiritual life is first and foremost. I have all sorts of feelings and have had in my life about that question you raised. Look, one of the first things I discovered was, as someone from a Protestant background and all that, sort of there's no way of discovering the deeper intellectual and spiritual dimensions of religion, especially intellectual ones, in that kind of particular Protestantism that was available where I grew up. So, but I sort of always envied people who were in the Middle Ages or in spiritual orders or whatever, because they would have that barrier against spiritual dissipation and secularism and so forth. But the odd thing was, as soon as you go back in history, be it in Islam or in Christianity, you're going to find people much more devoted, much less secularized in the sense that you're talking about it. But it turns out that they weren't necessarily making more progress than we are today. How many of you have had experience of, you learn something in school, let's say you study medicine. Would you know any medicine if you didn't practice in a hospital and be out there with people? No, you'd be a danger to society if you tried to do medicine from a medical textbook. So in a way, what you're calling the pre-secular societies are often kind of like, they have the answers, but you still have to find the interpreters or the teachers that will help you to apply those answers in the circumstances you live in today. And so, and the world, it's not just that the world is secularized, it's that the forms of life in the world are constantly changing. How many people here have conflicts either with parental and older religious figures who are trying to tell them things some way, but that's not the world I live in, or have conflicts with children and that you're trying to teach the children from your perspective and your experience, but they're saying, but Dad, that's not the world I live in now. How many people have that tension? No? You're all smoothly not at odds with parents and relatives and children. I just don't believe there's an honest, some people are laughing, that means you must know what I'm asking. Yeah, go ahead. You say you do have problems with that. Yeah. So what happens, seriously, your question is just so wonderful, because it's only when we tackle that question of what's real here and how do we communicate that reality that we begin to discover a truth that's true for other people and true for ourselves. And one of the things in one of these books out there about the Islamic Humanities openings book is that I went through the Quran and pulled out all the most common terms for the spiritual virtues in the Quran. And then I began to ask myself, well, how do we communicate, not the Arabic words of what they mean, how do we communicate what they mean? I mean, sometimes the Quran actually gives a pretty good explanation, but often you have to know the hadith or you have to know the later tradition. You have to know the stories that bring those terms alive. And then in each generation, you have to learn how do those stories apply to me here and now. The same is true with the Gospels and the stories that make up the Gospels. And so one thing I found, I guess, from living in France a lot of years was that movies often, there were serious movies that really dealt profoundly with the spiritual teachings at the roots of all the Abrahamic religions. And if they were about religion, students wouldn't watch them, the kind they show in Sunday schools or to a revival or whatever. But the ones that really got to people were the ones that were for unfamiliar environments and sort of showed people wrestling with precisely the issue that you're raising there. And ever since then, I've been teaching through films and doing workshops, and it's just I find films but it's not any film. It's like 1 in 100 that actually tackles the question that you're talking about there. Say something. There's recently Wim Wenders, who did several of the films I like to use in teaching, pretty elderly now, German filmmaker, did a film set in Japan, Tokyo, about one man called Perfect Days, about one man whose job is cleaning toilets every day. And you could not find a better film about what in Islam we call ihsan al-amal, that is doing something completely for God's sake, not for anything about yourself or what people think or whatever. It's like of complete devotion. And the whole point of it is that nobody expects that kind of saintly attitude, except maybe some Zen people, I don't know, but they don't expect that in somebody with that occupation. And yet the film is so powerful because the actor who plays it, you realize that he's actually trying to do God's will in everything he does, in every instant of his life. So I've talked on and on about it because I think everything I've taught is related to the question that you've raised there. And I started out so dumb in regard to this issue because I thought if I could just package the way that good Christian societies or good Muslim societies have done things, then it would be easy. But I couldn't figure out if that's true, then why are people all over the world giving up their traditional religious attitudes, and expectations, and forms, giving them up for the society of consumerism and making money and all of these kinds of things. But yeah, so I just say, look at the benefits of supposedly secular world. Because secular means like something cut off from God. Can you tell me what part of life is cut off from God? It's a non sequitur, it's a contradiction to the very expression. But we can be cut off from God. But that's something that we have to deal with out of our spiritual resources, the kinds of things I was talking about.
Okay.
Thank you. Fantastic question. Both of them.
Yeah, that's okay. Maybe one last question before we end up this discussion. Okay, from Anjo. We're waiting for your questions.
I know you want it to be over.
Happy that we still have last chance. Thank you, Nanda. Professor Morse, thank you very much. Very insightful. Teaching religious studies and giving the offer that religious experience is one of the things that we need to take into account, which is very important. And so I was actually expecting, if we take religious experience as what to take into account in teaching or engaging religious studies, I was expecting the category to come up with, as you said, religious experience, even spirituality is spontaneous. The things that we could find on the road, on the grassroots, everywhere. Like we have many Muslims, Christians on the road that we very seldom bring them into discussion in our room. And I was thinking if that would be also the religious experiences that we could mean in bringing into the discussion of religious studies. Their experiences as Muslims or as Christians or as religious people in relation to many dimensions of life, like the way they deal with their daily life. Is that the kinds that we could also think of as religious experience if we take Ibn Arabi's as a perspective for counting them, for accounting those experiences? I was struggling also like to think of it, and if we refer to Ibn Arabi, in order to understand what we experience, the meaning of what we experience by involving theological, philosophical, textual exercises, I'm worried if that prevents us looking at the everyday lay people experiences. So yeah, probably my question is around that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, when I was here teaching like 9 years ago, actually what I was trying to do was to use films in conjunction with religious classics, mostly Islamic, some Christian, precisely to help people make those connections. I think if you're very lucky in life, God will be your teacher at key moments. But that's a method that requires really suffering deeply and, you know, really giving up. And so then God rescues you. But for most of us, we need to find teachers, and they can be relatives, they can be actually anybody. I mean, most of those films were about people who find their teachers. You're talking about on the road. There's a film I use often from Brazil called Central Station. And it's about a very secular, disgruntled, despairing former teacher who ends up taking care of a child who she saw his mother die. And she doesn't have any children, doesn't want to have any or whatever. And they actually go on this road trip through Brazil until they come to the poorest part of Brazil. And there, it reminds me a lot of the passage in the Quran about someone who sees the mirage and thinks it's water. But when they go there, they discover that, no, the real water of life is something else. But in this case, she finds that water of life somewhere where she didn't expect it all. She's not religious, but because she's not religious, she was able to recognize the real thing because she was at a point where, a kind of breaking point, a point of surrender. But the important thing is, I think any of us, most of what I've talked about here is something that we can all share and talk about with people we know. What is it that keeps us from opening ourselves up to everyone but those who are either our beloveds or our parents, if we're on good relationships with our parents? But there's so few people in life that we can, in an unveiled, uncensored way, that we can actually experience share our experience. The ayah I love in the Quran about this is it says, at the end of the ayah, it says, "Amma bi'ni'mati rabbika fahaddith." Okay, so as for God's grace, God's bounty, God's benefits, talk about it, share it, you know. And that's not hard to put into advice, you know. It's just that we have to find people who are sympathetic, or you know, the occasion comes easy. Say you have a film group, or you have a reading group, and people in that group, if there's certain kinds of reading that if you're going to read these readings, be they spiritual or not, they're going to immediately force everybody to confront this kind of exchange of our actual experience. And likewise with really good films, you know. So the nice thing about this is that if people have one experience of qurb, of closeness to God, of closeness to others, they want more. Because there's a satisfaction of real, truly spiritual experience. There's a satisfaction there that is so much deeper than pleasures and distractions and so forth, that it's addictive. So, I'm sorry, but it is, you know. Getting close to God is addictive. I'll stand up for that, you know. But in a good sense, you know, it's like you want more of it, and you're never quite satisfied that it's complete. And you spontaneously then become a teacher for others. People come up to you, "What's your secret? Why are you smiling?" You know, you ever remember that? You know, it's so all the other questions kind of relate to the one you've just raised. Because you're a teacher, you must know this in teaching as well. Yeah. So thank you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pak James. Okay, give applause, everyone. Yeah, we're in end of our discussion, and yeah, there's a little bit gift, Pak James. You can have the poster in beautiful frame. Maybe, okay.
And also, the books are out there. If you these books
Oh
are
yeah,
about to
there's a
come out in
book.
print, so you can.
Yeah.
A lot of those are teaching materials. Yeah.
Okay. Mike? Okay. Pak Mike Quinlan, maybe you can give. Okay.
Oh.
No. That's so white. That's so white. No. Okay. We have every rituals. This is rituals of our Wednesday forum. Okay. Okay, and also there's one gift for our collaboration partner for Bapak Rektor Romo Albertus. Okay. Ya, sama Pak Rektor. Sana ada, Mak. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you everyone for engaging in our this Wednesday forum. And for next, we have a discussion about the life or Baduy Luar in Banten. And yeah, don't forget to follow our social media, CRCS/UGM and ICRS/Jogja on Instagram. And keep in touch with us through email crcs@ugm.ac.id and icrs@ugm.ac.id. And don't forget to visit our website to read our integrating perspective, articles, newsletters, and everything in our website, crcs.ugm.ac.id and icrs.or.id to know our master and doctoral program in religious studies. I am Nanda Sani and all team public edu of duty. Selamat sore and hati-hati di jalan.